I feel really bad. I feel like I want to take my Xanax, my whatever. What if I try taurine first? What if I try magnesium first? Both dopamine and serotonin are involved in plasticity in the brain in a way that's going to allow you to shift away from negative thoughts and back into a more kind of fluid state where you can just move on. If you have an issue with rumination, methylation is a really good place to start.
And he said the most challenging aspect of moving cattle is that cattle, like humans, want to eat what they think is tasty.
We're recording. Chris, take it away.
What's going on, everyone? We got another episode of the Holistic Dynasty podcast, and today we got our awesome guest, Bryce Hanna. We're going to be going very deep into maybe some concepts that you know of, maybe some concepts that you don't know of, and maybe how a lot of this bridges together. So welcome, Bryce.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, I really want to get into, I think, the best way, or one of the best ways that we can start this, and that's with really seeing what is Bryce Hanna's origin story. Not the cliff notes, but maybe the sequence of trials, experiences, and just ideas that really made you start questioning the standard health model as you've gone through your journey.
Yeah, I would say the light bulb moment for me happened pretty young. When I was around 16, I had some experiences with different like psychoactive drugs and medications that essentially, it was really like a revelation to me that different compounds or substances from outside the human body can so profoundly alter how you view reality. I hadn't really considered that concept in a serious way. And so when I encountered that, it was like just a complete shift in my understanding of how the world worked. And that was something that really has stuck with me for basically my whole life. It's really redefined my life in a way, because really it's like a rabbit hole that the further you go down it, the more you realize just how much our environment and the things we consume and everything affects us. So it's really obvious with certain things, like if you drink alcohol or something like that, you really expect to feel different, but it takes a lot more kind of complexity of understanding to get to the point where you realize that food and vitamins and even light can do the same thing. And so I would say, if there's one way to sum up my journey, it's been that the things that affect our consciousness just kind of know no bounds as far as the depth that can go. And so for many years, I was reading about pharmacology. That was sort of my first interest, was serotonin and dopamine and glutamate and these different things and how they affect the brain. But as I've gotten deeper, I've also learned about sort of other mechanisms through which these things affect kind of how cells function, how neurons function, modifying water structure, increasing solubility, these different things that are kind of a deeper level than just receptor functions. So that played a big part in it. I also had some kind of health issues around mental health and really a lot of like medication derived problems, I would say. I was prescribed SSRIs and other medications that really kind of messed up my stability for a long time. And that also kind of gave me some really big insight into how much the modern medical system is kind of checked out of actually helping people. It's really completely disconnected from what these compounds are actually doing and why they work or why they don't. And so I was prescribed a very high dose of Prozac, among other things. And when that produced symptoms of mania, for example, there wasn't any kind of accountability for the person that prescribed them. And there wasn't any understanding that you are causing problems that can then be diagnosed as further disorders. And it just creates this vicious cycle where you just continue to be put back into states that aren't ideal. So when I kind of learned to break that cycle, and when I was able to help myself with vitamins and food and other things, that also really redefined my understanding. So those are a few of the main things that kind of started my journey.
You know, it's really interesting hearing other people's ways that they sort of bridge themselves into these pathways that we talk about all the time on X and other platforms. But the sort of thing that binds us all together, regardless of our sort of base ideologies that we come from when we sort of enter the space, it all comes from this root of we enter some sort of medical conundrum, whether ourselves or a family member or a close friend or relative, and we see the flaws within them when we need them the most. And I kind of see this floor where, like, for me growing up, didn't really have any problems. So, thought the medicine group was great because I basically was in and out for yearly checkups until I got, severely ill in my early 20s. And then I'm like, oh, there are like these real pitfalls in not only problem solving, but critical thinking around those problems. And then the actual action items that are taken to deal with those problems. And then you're sort of just kind of pushed out the door. And I had a very similar experience with mental health medications. Like I was on Lexapro for several years and sort of developed like this almost like sexual apathy, which is a very common side effect with it. And I didn't even realize it till I was like, one day I'm like, well, I don't even know if this is doing anything. Just stopped it. And I was like, had this whole rush of things come back. And I didn't even realize how suppressed I was. And so I agree with you that there's sort of like this lack of curiosity component within academia, as well as someone that's like currently in academia studying from a conventional and also alternative lens, just like sitting from the glass wall, like looking in through the window. But there's also, I think, this overwhelm factor too of how do you actually centralize a system that works in a way that's really addressing all the systems. I think it's a very difficult problem. Maybe we can try to talk about that later. But kind of going back to your story, before you became what you're called now, photobiogenesis, which is, by the way, great ad. I love that ad. I'm actually jealous of that
ad. Thank you.
I'd love to know, just sort of, you sort of broached this component of your story, but what were you like intellectually in that entrance to it? You sort of mentioned pharmacology and interest in sort of like certain enzymatic pathways, but what were some of your earliest philosophies around health that caught your interest? And then how did that compound and bounce off to sort of the continuous evolution that you're in now?
Yeah, I would say I've had a lot of influences and a lot of like researchers and writers and people that are very dear to me as far as the impact that they've had on my own thinking. If I had to summarize it, I would say that I think my own thinking and my own work has been sort of an intersection point or a synthesis between three different areas of health philosophy. So the first has been kind of early on in my journey. I encountered Daniel, or Grimhood, as he's known on X, and it was through basically a mutual friend, like a local person that I knew, had shared one of his posts, and I started following him. We both had a mutual interest in pharmacology. And he had posted basically like a receptor affinity table for a compound, and he was having people guess what the compound was. And I was the only person that got it right, apparently. And so he'd messaged me, and we kind of started talking about this like shared interest that we had. And over time, we kind of developed like a friendship and a collaborative research relationship. And so I also spent some time talking to and working with his mentor and him directly, basically building on his mentor's kind of protocol and philosophy. And his mentor was a very kind of reclusive person. I mean, he would basically just send us these emails that were like in-depth kind of articles, like just piles and piles of research papers with not a ton of his own writing, kind of like connecting everything. And so a lot of my connection with that was secondhand or through like interpreting those emails and those research papers and like, why is he sending us this? What is he trying to say here? But even now, I'll go back to those emails sometimes and I'll just sit there and be like, wow, like I'm just now 3 years later or 4 years later coming around to this same concept. And he had sent me papers on this like years ago. And if I had just read every single thing that he said right from the start, I would have already understood this. And it's like, so he had really this very comprehensive understanding. He was a Canadian master herbalist, anonymous, but he was trained by another master herbalist that he mentioned. And so he was very oriented towards herbalism, but he also had certain kind of dietary viewpoints and structures that he would emphasize. And some of it's kind of mainstream, but other things were pretty idiosyncratic or unique to him. And so really, I think of him as a person who was less prolific in writing, but in understanding was very much on the level of someone like Ray Peat, for example. So I think in its own right, he created a framework that has been carried into the Twitter space through people like me and through people like Grimhood. And really, like, I don't even know if he fully understands this, but like the imprint that he's had on that space is massive. And it's like probably millions of people in the world have been reached by his ideas. I don't think we would have the popularization of things like inositol, Black Cedo without his work. And so that's been a massive influence for me. And that was sort of the starting point for me. From there, I kind of also came into really like the circadian sunlight space. There's a number of different people that have a lot of good work in that space. And that was really something inspirational to me. And it felt like the first thing that I really added to his work. He wasn't really promoting sunlight or infrared light or some of these different things in the same way. So that was a really big building point. And then kind of more recently, the last few years, I've really gained a lot of respect for the work of Ray Peat and people like Gilbert Ling, who I actually encountered some of these people before Ray Peat because they intersect also with a lot of the research around light and things like that. So people like Gilbert Ling and Mei-Wan Ho. And Ray Peat, I think, doesn't get the credit that he deserves in a certain way. He very much had a comprehensive understanding of the mechanisms of aging that when I've gone and read his work and then looked at other people in the aging space and what they're talking about, he was very, very contemporary with the general kind of zeitgeist or what people were talking about in that space. So while he gets kind of pigeonholed as this fringe thinker who was promoting like odd dietary habits or things like that, if you read some of his more kind of complex mechanistic articles or things like that, he had a grasp on the different factors that funnel into aging that I think few other people have. And really, he was a brilliant person who I regret not connecting with him on a personal level when I had the chance, but I sort of got into his work around the time that he died, which was really unfortunate and something that I regret because I think that's something else that's really informed my understanding. So photobiogenesis, it comes from this synergy of what I would call almost like a photobioenergetic nutrition. This all three of these areas coming together to create something new, and my own kind of attempt to build out that infrastructure into something that I hope 50 years from now will carry forward as a better model than any of the three on their own. So that's really, I think, the foundation that it's built on, and I've just continued to explore out different areas from there.
Incredible. There's so many follow-ups that I could unpack just from that one response. But forgive me if you listed the name and that totally went over my head, but you said that for you and Daniel or Grimhood that there is a mentor. Is this individual wanting to remain anonymous?
I don't know his name, honestly. He
Wow.
used like a moniker. I've searched the moniker. He doesn't have like online writing or anything that I could point people to. So, as I understand it, it's his desire to remain anonymous. If he ever wanted to publicly publish his information in a more kind of wider platform way, then I would be happy to facilitate that. I'm sure that Daniel would as well. But as I understand it, his desire is just to kind of work in peace.
The plot thickens.
That is incredible because I remember when I was probably like, I was a pre-med student at the time, and I was like 19, 20 years old. And I definitely had these very set beliefs on my own health journey. And I came from a family where my own mother had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, MCAS, POTS, the whole thing, where it's very easy to fall into the trap of my body's broken. And every single step along that health journey, when you go to the medical system, when you do a certain workout and your joints start acting up, maybe when another experience hits and that same programming might go in there, every time that experience builds up and it can build that sort of belief around things. And then we go through our health journey and we start going through it, and it might run from maybe more fear-based programming, where you're connecting disconnected facts, and we're looking at that silo-based thinking, And for many people, like throwing the human condition really into all of this, they're going through a lot in their own life to where they might not even think to look like, okay, maybe there's a way to solve this and go through this. Maybe with more courage and maybe with a way to get myself out of the headspace that this sort of approach or whatever approach that might be the new thing, if you will, is going to take me away from that symptom. So what I would ask is, what would your wisdom be to that sort of individual who might be going on a health journey and they're just having a lot of difficulty with building their philosophy, and they might be going through different things with sort of this mentality of things existing in a silo, just kind of looking to get over whether symptom it might be or whatever it might be in general that they're kind of experiencing. I know for me, where at the time when I found Grim, it was because I had so many health issues of my own, and I was vomiting stomach acid. I had very similar issues to my mom, and it felt like my body and the prophecy for the life is all coming true and all that. And at the time, there's a lot of me, or a lot of parts of me, who was like, maybe I should look at these individual things. So if you have any sort of wisdom on that, I'd love to hear a monologue.
Yeah, I think part of the difficulty that I face when I'm kind of writing online is that there's two opposite kind of audiences, or very separated audiences that I think about. And one of them is that, some of this stuff I'm really like pushing into areas that are very cutting edge or not a lot of people know about them, or I'm like building on topics that are building on topics that are building on things. And it feels in some cases like I'm writing for people that are like really advanced on this. Like I'm writing stuff that's going to impact other health coaches and other people that are super deep in their research, but that the average person's going to read it and be like, I don't really know what this is about. I don't know how this is relevant to me. And the other group of people is that in my day-to-day life, I'll meet people that are just, their understanding of nutrition or supplements is so far from anything that like any little advertising, any little thing they hear is like for the first time. Like they've never heard of supplementing even something like magnesium, which is a very common thing on X, but it's like when you talk to people in real life, that's like not even entered their world that sort of thing is out there. So I think about it a lot from the perspective of like, I need to bridge that gap, and I need to give advice and sort of approach things from a perspective that my parents could benefit from, that a woman that I meet in the grocery store could benefit from, that the people in the world that might just chance upon this, that they're going to be able to access that information. And so there's certainly things that you can do that are very much like entry level, like sun exposure, like exercise. Some of the concepts I start with nutrition are satiation and nutrient density. These are very much like the foundations of how I sort of start educating about the importance of like certain foods or things like that. Avoiding processed foods or things that are designed to be hyper palatable and addictive. Once you start with these sort of basic frameworks, a lot of the time you can see more than 50% improvement from that alone. This is also why I think a lot of diets that are very different work seemingly equally well. You'll have people that start a vegan diet or start a keto or low carb diet, and they'll both report the same sort of improvements. And it's because when you start with what the average person's eating, it's easy to lose this when you're kind of in this space, but the average person doesn't even really have a conception that something like fast food is that bad, or they're told that it is, but they don't understand why. And when you change that, when you change these habits, when you start supplementing a nutrient for the first time, when you start eating whole food instead of processed food, these things alone can be like waking up, and you can suddenly say, okay, I feel better than I ever have. And I didn't think this was possible. And I think the goal is to get people to that information and to that point before they're resorting to things like medications, like a antidepressant or something like that, which will lock them into this dependence on taking a chemical to fix a problem that if they had started going to the gym or started eating a better diet, that would have been able to be corrected without that. So I I think if I can help even one person in that way, I'll be happy. But if I can help hundreds, then I'll be even happier. So that's really what I'm kind of thinking about first and foremost.
I think that's really admirable because I think as you experienced, I mean, just going through one, your own journey, but two, when you started creating content online and just sort of gauging the ethos of the generic population and their education around, well, scientific topics, but just health as one of those subsets, you find that pretty much, and I forget because I think we all kind of live, all three of us, in a bit of a bubble until we go out, you know, to an event or you talk to like friends and family members and you're like, oh, you really don't even know like step one of metabolism. Like
Right.
it's actually kind of wild the questions I'll get from my friends about like my blue blockers or the weird lights in my house or anything like that. And I'm just like, oh, I forget that I've been on this journey for 7 years and you're like step zero, me like, you know, before the fall. And so one thing that we come across, because me and Chris tend to work with an array of clients, but I would say the majority, at least from the ones that we've been on taking recently, sort of border on this more complex case scenario where they're dealing with these multi-systemic fires in multi-systems of the body, and they've gotten a fairly well understood general knowledge of some of these basic concepts. Like they've explored like maybe circadian health, they've explored dietary things. Maybe they have like massive dietary restrictions because of sensitivities with things like MCAS and other aspects of their life. And what they're really missing, and I find this for everyone, but when you deal with someone, I mean, like myself or Chris's own personal cases or some of our clients who are really in this severe situation, what I find that's often missing that needs to be set and really set up first is a framework. Like they really don't have a framework for their ideology and philosophy. They've just been gathering information. And as I sort of learned on my own journey, it sort of goes back to this Socrates principle that I think was actually detailed by Plato of all I know is I know nothing. And so there are these certain entry points that everyone makes on their journey. Maybe it starts with diet, maybe it starts with supplements, maybe the combination of the two. Maybe they go down that path, maybe their problems are a little more severe. Those things don't really touch it in the way that they get to. I know for me, diet kind of pushed me 20% down the line. And then maybe they enter into some of these more esoteric spaces around like more advanced supplementation like peptides, or maybe they're learning about circadian biology and EMFs, and then they get overwhelmed. And then they're like, okay, now I'm doing a million things. Nothing seems to be working. There's no clear pattern recognition. And I'm also just unable to even rationally think because I don't have these substrates that are going into the system that are being metabolized and assimilated. And then, you know, there's all these other things going on at play. So if someone were to like sit down and really like begin synthesizing your work for like a year-long span, what would be the model of health you want that person that I'm sort of describing as one archetype to take away from more of a framework position?
I'd say there's different components to it. So there's a few different kind of areas of this. So I think what I'm moving toward is this idea that disease and aging kind of operates along certain channels or pathways, and that those pathways can interact with each other. And that those pathways can often be targeted by sort of medicinal foods or substances or materials that cover a wide range of those different pathways in a protective way. So, for example, one thing that's been really interesting to me the past few years is hypoxia and circulation. So this idea that basically, for example, depression and anxiety and things like that, part of their underlying cause is insufficient blood flow to the brain. So we can sort of think of it like, if we're just sort of talking about mental health as one aspect of this, we can think of it as the brain operates on sort of three primary substrates, not counting like vitamins and minerals and these other nutrients. So it requires oxygen, it requires glucose, and it requires stimulation. So each of those is something that you can target, and they sort of intersect in different ways. But for example, with glucose, the starting points that you might approach that from would be something like maintaining your blood sugar in a way where you're not going to see big spikes and crashes. So this is very common in things like ADHD and depression, that people are more sensitive to blood sugar dysregulations, and they're they're more prone to that, and sometimes there's underlying physiological issues that contribute to that. So something like eating a complex of foods that's not just isolated sugars or isolated carbs in a meal, that's more like fiber and protein and maybe fat paired with carbs, things that are going to kind of buffer carbohydrates as they enter your body and cause less of that sharp spike and crash. So that might be one element of that. And that's where things like one of the things that I promote is this sort of eating high fiber breakfast, flax and chia, hemp seeds, things like that in the morning, or consuming fruit or things like that throughout the day that are providing additional fiber. The benefit of that would be buffering that blood sugar. So then there's other elements to this, which is that you can specifically target more of the blood flow aspect. And this might be things like infrared light, basically anything that's going to sort of stabilize circulation is going to have this positive effect of greater oxygenation to the brain. And a lot of plant compounds have these protective effects, like the flavonoid family of compounds that's found in citruses, it's found in some of the herbs that I talk about a lot. They have this effect of kind of lowering blood pressure and promoting circulation. Black seed oil has a similar effect on that. And you can kind of go deeper and say that in aging, things that prevent calcification and the aggregation of proteins will also prevent blockages in microcirculation, similarly keeping lipid markers in line and not having elevated like LDL particle count and things like that. Over time, that will also promote better circulation. And then with stimulation, there's sort of this more philosophical aspect of it, which is that you want to look at things like, are you being exposed to novelty? Are you learning exciting new information? Are you in new places that you're not usually exposed to? Are you kind of experiencing reality in a way that's playful and enjoyable? Or are you locked into these like routines where you're in like a low stimulation environment, or the stimulation that you're exposed to is sort of this like artificially generated novelty where things like scrolling or pornography or things like that, there's like endless novelty, but it's sort of optimized in a way that's going to make the real world seem less bright and enjoyable. So when you look at it from that perspective, you need to kind of nourish your body through these different pathways. And a lot of these things intersect. You know, when it comes to magnesium, for example, magnesium is one that's going to sort of reduce stress, reduce some of the circulatory issues. It's going to help with blood sugar regulation. It's going to protect neurons under conditions where those kind of three main factors aren't met. Like if you have a drop in blood sugar or you have hypoxia in the brain, that's going to be protected against by magnesium. And then it's also going to have some more longer term impacts. Like it's one of the few substances that can actually reverse calcification and some of these arterial plaque issues and things like that. So you also see these very broadly protective compounds. And that's sort of what I focus on first, is things like magnesium and infrared light and incorporating whole foods into the diet that have these medicinal components. So really, there's a lot to it. My interests and my kind of focuses are pretty wide ranging, but a lot of it comes down to targeting these sort of central roads that aging progresses down and seeing how we can sort of interrupt those processes.
That makes a ton of sense. That was very beautifully articulated. For anybody who's starting out, because I'll say that one thing that I've noticed in my time of just working with quite a bit of people is if, for example, they have like neuropathy or this hyperexcitable nervous system or, you know, like those sorts of things where maybe some of the cases are even like housebound. Would you say that obviously like we want to see what's feasible, what can you tolerate, what's not going to drive you toward like feeling terrible and spiking symptoms like crazy? For anything, right? Like there's a certain threshold, but when you're working with people and you're kind of like seeing that for the person, do you notice that there's like typically a pattern within the personal hierarchy of different things you use to support one's health, whether it be light, sleep, minerals, digestion, food quality, movement, their nervous system status, maybe even the beliefs tied to emotional stress from certain traumatic events? Do you notice that there's like an overall hierarchy of like, okay, these things got to be on the base of the pyramid for this sort of thing, and we really want to look into this. Whereas these ones, we can work toward getting that there, but maybe at some point we can slowly work to that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's definitely some things that are more kind of need to be emphasized first and foremost. So magnesium is really a big one. Like, this is one that I think, just because it intersects with pretty much every pathway, I think it's one of the most foundational starting points. So, and this is something that really Daniel and I's mentor was very emphatic on, was that before you start anything else, you need to work toward a magnesium surplus. And really, the reason that this works is that on a fundamental level, the cell stress response and stimulation response is governed by the influx of calcium. Calcium and magnesium behave differently in the way that they interact with water. So magnesium, the way that you can look at this, I really dug into this at one point, and it seems that the fundamental aspect of why magnesium does what it does, I unpacked this all in this 30-page long article on my website at one point, where basically the reason magnesium is what it is, why it is the kind of central mineral that the body uses more than almost really anything else, is that it has the optimal charge to size ratio to carry out functions with water. So when you have a charged particle or a charged atom present in water, it will cause water to organize around it, and it forms what's called a hydration shell. So with magnesium, it has a particularly strong interaction because of the four main ions that are used in sort of chemistry. It has the smallest size relative to its charge. So it's really the smallest of the four with a +2 charge. That gives it a very intense surface charge. And so water kind of sticks to it in a way, and it causes layers of water to form around it that are structured. And this gives it a property that allows it to be used for what are called hydrolysis reactions, where it's actually using and splitting a water molecule to break a chemical bond, like a peptide bond, for example. When you break a protein bond, it splits the water molecule to kind of fill in the gap on each side. And so by doing that, magnesium facilitates a ton of different reactions. Because of its small size, it also serves a lot of structural roles where things can kind of wrap around it, or it's sort of like a central charge particle that proteins will link to at different points so they can be stabilized. And the other interesting aspect of this is, because it interacts so strongly with water, it tends to be very stable in its positioning. It doesn't move around very quickly. And when you look at something like calcium, calcium is the opposite. It's not the largest particle, but it is the one kind of level down as far as the size goes. And so it has a much lower size to charge ratio. And so because of that, calcium has a lower interaction with water. It does still structure water, but it diffuses more quickly into cells. And so once it enters the cell, you see this activation that occurs where different proteins will actually change their shape as they accept calcium into their structure. And so that creates a lot of the different stimulation responses. So, for example, in cardiac muscles, when calcium enters cardiac muscles, it causes them to contract, and you see the heart rate increase. When calcium enters the digestive muscles, it's going to cause the contraction of smooth muscles that causes food to move through the bowel. When it enters neurons, it's going to cause the neuron to polarize and fire, because you're going to see this big increase in positive charge. And so if you look at magnesium and calcium together, magnesium can basically fit into a lot of the same positions in proteins because it has the same +2 charge. But because it is a smaller atom, it's going to cause those proteins to not hold the correct conformation that they need to be activated. So it's sort of a placeholder that acts to raise the threshold for calcium to activate cells. And when not enough magnesium is present, you basically see this hypersensitivity to calcium, both in the brain and in the body. And we sort of think of this most in the brain, like magnesium is this calming factor, and it reduces excess firing in neurons, it relieves anxiety and helps with sleep. But it has deeper functions beyond that, where if a cell is stressed, like in hypoxic conditions and inflammation and these other kind of more tissue related problems, magnesium is going to have the same effect. The other thing is that we have sort of a reservoir of minerals in our bone where we can actually pull magnesium out of bone and into circulation. So you won't really see low blood levels of magnesium until you get to pretty extreme deficiency. Whereas the level of magnesium in the brain or in different cells or things like that will be affected much more quickly. And it's highly dependent on stress. We actually see, for example, there's a study on active duty military where they excrete about 20% more magnesium in their urine per day than like the average civilian. So there's conditions where you can have a higher magnesium burn rate, where basically you're using more magnesium on a daily basis. And if you imagine 20% higher demand for magnesium, that would bump the RDI, the minimum kind of intake that you can get by on, from 400 milligrams to 500 milligrams. And a lot of people aren't even hitting that. So if you think about it from that standpoint, your body's stores are going to be depleted very quickly over time. And you're going to get to a point where you actually see sort of some degree of magnesium deficiency symptoms, even though you might not be at the kind of critical level where it would be medically diagnosable with a blood test. So things like that are very important. Another thing I look at is the use of what I call the cardinal inhibitory substances. These are things that are L-theanine, glycine, taurine, inositol, and of course magnesium itself. And these are things that basically counteract this calcium activation and the activation of glutamate, which is sort of upstream and actually causes calcium influx when it activates certain receptors. These are factors that inhibit that in different tissues in the body. So this is another kind of foundational concept where I think there's sort of an aspect of health where it's optimal to be in a state where you're sort of cool, calm, collected, and able to accurately assess your situation. And a lot of the time, things that impair this, like neuroinflammation, for example, can cause sort of symptoms of brain fog and things like that. Like if you've ever had the flu or an infection, this is a good example where you can't think straight, you feel very tired and groggy. A lot of people will either feel that way after a meal, or they'll feel that way after eating certain foods like gluten, or just in a general sense, they'll be in that state and they won't realize it. And it's not until they take sort of an inhibitory substance, which not only inhibits excess firing and anxiety and things like that, but also can inhibit the release of histamine and cytokines in the brain. When they sort of access that state, they might for the first time be able to really assess things in a meaningful way and say, okay, I feel normal now. How do I keep this going? And my thought is sort of, if you have to take something like L-theanine every few hours at the beginning to keep that state going, then that'll give you the clarity of mind to sort of start to make other changes. And so that's a very important starting point. Beyond that, it really comes down to more kind of long acting changes. Like when it comes to nutrition, you'd want to focus on nutrient dense foods. What can I eat that's going to provide me the most nutrition in sort of a small amount of calories, like oysters, like liver, like a few eggs per day? Sometimes adding things like that can begin to resolve deficiencies that you weren't really aware of. And so once you sort of stabilize your intermediate state, then you can start to incorporate things that are going to over time resolve these issues. And infrared light to me is another really powerful thing that's going to, both in the short term and the long term, have this sort of medicinal effect where you see things like hypoxia start to get resolved. You see better tissue levels of antioxidants that might lower inflammation and help get some of these organs kind of functioning optimally again. And over time, you'll start to sort of guide your health toward a better point that will actually allow you to feel better. But the foundational things are whatever gets you stabilized in that intermediate or short-term phase.
I got some good follow-ups. Your magnesium breakdown. We could do like a whole other episode to just go over magnesium, I bet. But
yeah,
I know I totally agree. Just as somebody who's been through a more complex health journey before, when I was really going through that, and I was able to get my nervous system and just my mind and my body in like a calmer place using magnesium and even different GABAergics. It was so helpful to be able to get there and really assess, because when you heal, there's often like this fear-driven component of like, I need somebody to save me. I need the medical professional to do this. I need this person to do that. And that's not true. Like, you don't need that. And there are certain instances where, yes, it can be extremely helpful. Like if I break my arm, I best be going to the doctor, obviously. But when you're going through like this chronic journey, there's just people who sit there in that fear response for so long, and that was myself for so long, with the idea that I was somewhat broken, thinking that I needed to either do this or that all the time. And really being able to take magnesium, take magnolia bark, take L-theanine, whatever it might be, to be able to do these things really helped me get into that headspace and actually think and prioritize what needed to be done to take this into my own hands and have the courage to face the uncertainty of what that would even look like. So going through it, there's a lot of tinkering when I finally did get through a lot of like that initial fear. And as you might imagine, when I went through certain things, maybe I felt really bad or I reacted terrible. I remember one time I took a biofilm disruptor, and I actually thought that World War III was going to occur shortly after, and I was in like a pretty bad MCAS state to begin with, so I really didn't respond well to that one, and I was rolling on the floor for hours. So for anybody on like a healing journey, when they hear like magnesium, how do we get to this magnesium surplus in a way where we're just in a good spot? Especially if you're somebody who's been through a health issue and you're going through one and you have health anxiety and maybe perfectionism, and the level of emotional stress that your nervous system takes every day is pretty extreme. How would you say, in general, like one would work toward building that magnesium surplus? What would be like some of the things that you would consider in like building that out and intelligently asking ourselves like the right question to be able to like tinker with it and then have kind of like the right biofeedback through that process?
Yeah, something else you mentioned that really brings up an interesting thought for me is that there's sort of a state that you can get to with negative health and with this like overexcitation or inflammation, where it's like you short circuit and you'll do anything to make it feel better, even in the short term. Like you will do self-destructive things that you know aren't right or that you know are going to make you feel worse tomorrow in order to fix
The
it today.
symptom, not the system.
Right. So that's what drives a lot of addictions for people. And sometimes those can be food. Sometimes those can be drugs. Sometimes it can be a sedative like alcohol or something like that. Is you get in this state and it can be sometimes induced by the drug, like withdrawal or something like that. But in early phases, it can be induced by health issues, by overexcitation of the nervous system, by inflammation. And you get in this state where it's like, this feels so bad that I'll do anything to fix it. And in extreme examples, I mean, that's what drives people to overdose, to do these like really terrible things, is that they get into such an extreme state of physical discomfort that they'll do anything to manage it. And so being able to recognize those states and finding tools to manage them in the short term without having to rely on that, to say, okay, I feel really bad. I feel like, I want to take my Xanax, my whatever. What if I try taurine first? What if I try magnesium first? Those can sort of interrupt those cycles. And that's a really, really good starting point. As far as just getting to a baseline of like not having those big fluctuations where you feel horrible, I think the best way to think about it is that magnesium, you can only absorb so much in a given period of time. So magnesium sort of has this reputation for having a laxative effect. Sometimes this is called the bowel flush. You also see like forms of magnesium that are sold as laxatives, like milk of magnesia and things like that. And the laxative effect isn't inherently harmful in the sense of like if you have constipation or things like that, overshooting can sort of help break up a different form of stagnation, like indigestion or things like that. But it's not necessarily like a goal within itself. It's not something you want to shoot for. Having this bowel flush, like it doesn't really benefit you outside of just fixing a digestive issue, which often will resolve over time on its own just with repleting things like magnesium. So I would generally try to avoid that. And that means that the best way to take magnesium is to take forms that are absorbed well. So I like amino acid bound forms a lot, magnesium glycinate or magnesium taurate. Some people use magnesium malate as well. That one absorbs fairly well. And when you take these different forms, basically you want to sort of start with something like 100 milligram dose in the morning, add another dose in the evening, add another dose at lunchtime. And you can sort of fill in from there and say, okay, I'm going to take it every 3 or 4 hours, however long. I'm going to take a little bit extra before bed. And you can kind of work in as much as you can tolerate. Some people tolerate magnesium really well. Like they can take very high amounts. They don't have this excessive bowel flush. Whereas other people are very, very sensitive to it. Like they have some absorption issue where they can only tolerate like a little bit at a time. And individually, you need to work in as much as you can without sort of overshooting, because, I mentioned that magnesium sort of retains and has this interaction with water. That bowel flush is caused by that interaction with water. Magnesium prevents water from being pulled out of the bowel, and it keeps it sort of locked in. And so excess magnesium left over at the end of your digestive system that didn't get absorbed is what's causing that. So that's sort of wasted magnesium. You want to focus more on spreading it out rather than just increasing the dose at a given time. And the other thing you can use is topical magnesium, which is absorbed, has very kind of potent short-term effects where often you'll see like a very fast, sharp increase in blood level, which is especially tangible as far as like if someone's having a panic attack or a seizure or something like that. This is a great time to apply topical magnesium. It might not resolve it completely in every case, but it is going to actually at least sort of calm them down in a noticeable way. And a lot of the time, this is something that is a short-term intervention that you can really feel, and it can kind of give you a sense of this is what it's doing. Even when I take it as a pill, I'm just noticing it more potently right now because I'm absorbing a lot of it. So topical magnesium sort of bypasses the limits of gut absorption, and you can use that on a more regular basis in a way that's going to kind of build up your stores and your body's saturation over time as well. So I like to combine the two. I would say either like a topical magnesium spray, or more recently I've even been kind of promoting things like foot soaks, where you can get like a tray and put a few pounds of magnesium chloride or Epsom salt in. And while you're reading or while you're working, you can have that you can be soaking your feet in magnesium and absorb it over time. Of course, also a bath works. You need quite a bit more for a bath, like usually a few pounds minimum to really feel that effect. But even just before you take a shower, like really soaking your back with magnesium spray, doing a few rounds, let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes and really kind of feel that effect. And then take a shower, wash it off so your skin isn't all salty. That can be a really great way to just sort of incorporate it into a daily routine.
I have a really interesting one for you around magnesium chloride. And I've actually talked to Grimhood about this. And he had a really intriguing answer for me on this question. But when I was really going through my health things toward the beginning, I of course tried the magnesium chloride. And I would break down into like these hives almost. And a few of my clients who were just a bit more like reactive to certain things noticed like a similar thing as they were going through it. And I've heard many interesting things around it, and I've looked into it and haven't necessarily formulated like an official perspective on why that may be. But I do know that as I've gotten healthier and healthier, I don't really notice any hives from spraying that on my skin anymore.
Yeah.
So why do you think that sort of thing can happen when people do magnesium chloride? And in your perspective, for somebody like obviously taking radical responsibility for their own health, do you have any advice for when to like go through that symptom and push through it versus kind of going around it and saying like, we're going to come back to this eventually, but not good right now?
So it definitely stems from the chloride. You do see this occasionally, like to varying degrees. Some people get like itchiness. Some people feel that their skin is dry after applying magnesium chloride specifically. So Epsom salt chemically is magnesium sulfate. And I haven't met anyone that has the same effect with magnesium sulfate. So this really suggests that it's some reaction with the chloride. As far as what's happening specifically, I don't think anyone really knows for sure, but I think the best assumption is that it's either like the chloride stimulating some sort of allergic response with like a hyperactive immune system, like histamine or things like that. The skin as an organ really produces a lot of histamine, acetylcholine, and serotonin, which regulate this sort of allergic inflammatory response. So something with the chloride is activating that. The other question is whether it's the chloride on its own, like some way that it's altering the pH of the skin, or just absorbing directly and affecting these immune cells, or it's possible that there's things like bacterial byproducts that chloride is either reacting with to form like a new, more allergic compound, or that it might be that you have something like dysbiosis in the skin, and chloride alters the pH or the structure of the skin in such a way that improves the absorption of those sort of skin derived allergens and bacterial.
Yeah.
So
is it possible if somebody's in like a T helper cell 2 dominant state and they're prone to things like candida, that the chloride causes like a problem in a sense with just like the environment, and maybe it turns from like commensal yeast to hyphae, or is that
yeah, I think one way to kind of think about this is that there's a concept called haptens, which is that basically this is like small molecular structures that on their own shouldn't be large enough to cause antigen formation. So like things like citric acid or other kind of small molecule like food additives like benzoate and things like that, that normally they should be too small to cause like an antigen to form in the immune system to target it. If they are complexed in different ways with like another ion, or if they react with a larger protein, then basically that small molecule can then come to act as like the target of an antigen. So even though what's actually activating the immune system is like the chloride bound to this bigger protein structure or something like that, I think it can become like a sensitized thing where basically that substructure can then go on to activate the immune system more easily. And so people can develop these sensitivities. Typically they're not permanent, but they do sort of stem from that immune state where you see this tendency toward hyperactivation. It occurs a lot with autoimmunity, with MCAS, with allergies. So I don't know if it's possible to say that it's candida or something specifically, but I do think there's a component that's either bacterial or some other compound produced in the skin that is sort of amplified by interaction with like a smaller molecule like chloride or something else. So that's probably along the right track.
This is an interesting topic because it sort of invokes the idea of individual nuance, which I think is one of those factors that in a conventional sense everyone already knows doesn't exist. but in sort of a naturopathic sense, that's what you're going there for. At least that's like what I was sold on the idea of. And I find that oftentimes, and we see it online a lot, and I tell people when you're consuming information online, it's sort of like you're playing to an algorithm, but you're not a perfect algorithm. And therefore, the content you consume needs to be distilled from that point of view. But when you're sort of working with somebody, or like the clients we have sort of fit into this bracket of there's a lot of variation in symptomology and reaction. And so pretty much everybody I approach from like a blank slate. Like I literally like visualize a blank Google document when I look at them and I talk to them, and then I sort of look for pattern recognition within their story and their past, and then their biochemistry and things like that. We kind of collaborate to bring these all together and find starting points. But one thing that I really care about, based on just my own experience and just sort of this analogy that we've been talking about just now, is this idea of individual work and not necessarily healing always through templates in certain scenarios. How do you think about that sort of individual context and nuance when it comes to not only your work, but just applying concepts? Like, how would you sort of like iterate that to an audience as far as like distilling that information for themselves?
Sure. I think this goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, just with starting with the basics. Like, I think that the average person will tolerate like inhibitory substances very well. Like, for example, I had somebody that I spoke with at one point who was he had been like a heavy user of benzodiazepines, the same class that like Xanax and Valium and things are in, and these are strong GABAergic pharmaceuticals. So because he had sort of been dependent on them and come off of them, you see a lot of the time like this potentially permanent, but probably more like decade long kind of dysregulation where people can be hypersensitive to certain interventions. You see this a lot with autoimmunity, histamine issues, other things as well, where people become very hypersensitive. And because of that, he sort of had gone through different like GABAergic or calming herbs, supplements, etc., that he had tried. And like literally we just went through the list and it was like, okay, how about this? Nope, gives me a rebound. How about this? Nope, I can't sleep if I take that. And there were some really that we came across that I would mention it and he'd be like, actually, wait, yeah, that does work. And it's the main inhibitory substances. Like it was magnesium, taurine. I think L-theanine was kind of hazy for him, but it's like these different things that really like most anyone can tolerate them. And so I think you do have starting points almost in every case. And then beyond that, you can build out nuance from there. So with certain things, there's a sort of bridge that you have to make between how can I educate on like 90% of people will benefit from this, so I'm going to talk about it, but also there needs to be a caveat here because the other 10% are not going to react well to it. With things like fiber, for example, I sort of try to meet the middle and say, I'm going to say well-digested fiber is what you want to include. And specifically, here's some sources that most people digest well. If you don't tolerate them well, we can kind of work around that. So these sort of broadly beneficial concepts, finding what people do tolerate, and negative reactions are very informative. So, for example, there's this whole concept of like methylation, for example, where it's kind of a complex chemical cycle that requires multiple different nutrients. But if people don't react well to vitamin B3, for example, vitamin B3 binds methyl groups in the liver and removes them from the methylation cycle. So if somebody doesn't react well to that, and even small amounts really set them off, that can tell you, okay, maybe there's something going on with methylation where they already have a deficiency in this methylation cycle. And so we're just pulling out from an already depleted pool, and we need to avoid this supplement until we can figure out what's going to replenish that pool. And so certain things like that can be very informative, and just trying to figure out like why someone doesn't react well to something can really give you as much information as what they do react well to. So I think that's a good starting point, is sort of applying things that are broadly useful and then fine tuning what necessarily is more individualistic.
You know, that's a really good point. It's a great segue into the next topic I wanted to get into with you on methylation. But a sort of funny instance with this, we have several people in our school community that have pretty severe reactions to like almost anything. And then they're sort of in this negative feedback loop of the things they do handle, maybe contributing to things like yeast overdose or fungal overdose. And so it's like this like toxic loop that they're in. And one thing that I like to have people start doing early on, just because there's no real ingestion of anything physically if you are highly reactive, and at least we can set aside the psychological fear aspect of that, even though they could probably handle certain things they may be unwilling at first because of their experience. I like to do with them some form of like nervous system resetting. So some like vagal toning exercises, maybe some working on like diaphragmatic breath, things like that, that might just like give them some level of safety signals that they can handle and that anyone literally can do. And I think there's varying levels and different probably inputs that determine how well they work for you. But I find that surprisingly, we've had several people that have pretty severe situations just implement those as a starting point, because it gives them an action item and something to like lean on, and something that they feel confident in doing without having a reaction that may be triggered partially psychosomatically with other things going on as well. And surprisingly, it's amazingly successful. So I think, like you said, it's like finding the starting points for them, like being really minimalistic, but also targeting like finding that, like collecting the data, like knowing like, oh, you have a positive thing with this, let's lean into that. But on methylation, you know, it's really fascinating because it was one of the very first things that I ever learned about and read about, because I have very, very negative MTHFR mutations, at least on paper. what I
Yeah.
found fascinating about that is when you kind of jump into the Facebook groups or like you're reading on Reddit or whatever, there's not a lot of nuanced discussion around it, at least like in the larger scheme. And so a lot of it's just straight up talking about MTHFR in the scheme of like methylated B12 and like methylated folate. But there's like so much more to that that's like
Right.
blown away. And like there are instances where like people like me, I would assume based on just reading that generic information, oh, I should supplement with methylfolate. Well, a lot of the supplements you find online are mega high dosages of those methylated B vitamins. And I have other genetics that actually might get in the way of, oh, maybe high dose methylfolate's not good for Ryan. And so these are these contexts that you have to like put together and not just look at one pathway per se. But I'd love for you to maybe explore like what is the deeper understanding of methylation physiology that maybe like the generic conversation is missing that could be impacting somebody's journey.
Sure. Something that I've really kind of come to the conclusion of is that methylation isn't inherently like a problem to be solved in every individual. Like there are different variations in it that can just sort of create like a personality characteristic that's not necessarily a problem. So if you go and you get your genes analyzed and it says, oh, you have MTHFR or COMT variations that predispose you to this, that's not always something that you need to just say, okay, I have to take a supplement now. It's like you need to assess it from the standpoint of personal kind of life experience and say, do I feel bad? Do I feel like this is actually causing me detriment? Because a lot of the time these have to sort of co-intersect with like deficiency or different things like that, or multiple deficiencies before they're really noticeable. Like most severe undermethylation issues that I've encountered, like you can see they're B12 deficient on their blood work or something that's very simple like that. It's like in more often than not, the people that they have these sort of symptoms, but there's not necessarily deficiency, maybe it's impacting them negatively to some extent, but it's especially noticeable when you do have like a straight up deficiency in some nutrient. But the other thing is that some of these pathways, they have cofactors or different things that aren't necessarily on the main radar. So if you look at like methylation support nutrients, there's the standard you mentioned, methyl B12, methylfolate. These are like the easiest because they directly feed into that cycle. They turn homocysteine back into methionine, and then methionine can then be converted into the methyl donor SAMe, and that can then go on to kind of have these positive effects. But there's other things that in some cases can be more individual bottlenecks. For example, there's a pathway called PEMT, which synthesizes choline using methyl groups. And some people, they specifically have an issue with that. And so they benefit most from a little bit more choline, but the other methylation kind of cofactors, they don't really require in the same way. In another sense, like creatine, some people are benefiting from creatine because creatine is the most kind of methylation depleting synthesis process in the body. And so if you take creatine and you notice all these improvements, sometimes it's because you're just taking some load off of the methylation pathways by taking that out of the equation and saying you don't need to synthesize this, even though like I think it's more than 50% or 40% of the methylation reactions are going toward creatine. And then there's other things like MTHFR itself has a cofactor, which is vitamin B2. And so if you're fine on folate, maybe vitamin B2 deficiency is what's actually causing you to not express that in the same way. Even if your genetics say, this isn't going to function optimally for you, that can be misleading if you also have a B2 deficiency, because you could be blaming the genetics for the B2 deficiency's symptoms. And so there's things like that that can all kind of funnel into this. In general, I would say food first is a good approach, like things that are naturally high in B vitamins. Meat and animal products already contain those B vitamins in the methylated forms. And so that can be a good starting point. And then just sort of troubleshooting from there. B6 is another one. A lot of the time when people have methylation symptoms, it's actually a buildup of the methylation waste product, homocysteine, which homocysteine has actually some pharmacology itself. It mimics glutamate. It binds to the NMDA glutamate receptors and activates those calcium channels in the same way that glutamate does. And it's also a negative modulator of the dopamine D2 receptor. So you can have this sort of blunting. And a lot of the time, one thing that's kind of interesting is that rumination comes down to both a serotonin and a dopamine issue. So with something like rumination, to me, this is like the best individual personality metric of methylation. Like more than anything else, if someone's dealing with a lot of rumination, if they're fixating on negative thoughts, if you literally can't fall asleep because you're looping over like stuff that happened years ago, that's a state where it sort of starts to veer more into impairment, and this is a negative impact on your life. And so in that case, methylation can help because it's sort of clearing that. But the other thing is that that dopamine system is required to help reset this. If your dopamine tone is sort of set very high, like if you're constantly dealing with like an elevated background dopamine, this sounds counterintuitive. Like you should benefit from this. You want your dopamine high. But if your dopamine's up here, then if it increases further, that doesn't feel like much. Whereas your brain's able to clear it properly, and if it's able to kind of keep it stable more in the middle, then things that spike your dopamine are going to feel like more. And that can be lifestyle stuff. That can be like social media usage and things like that can keep your dopamine kind of artificially elevated so you don't feel the spikes as much. But it can also be things like methylation, because COMT is required to turn over dopamine and adrenaline and these sort of both reward and stress hormones. So if you're not able to conduct methylation optimally, homocysteine is reducing that dopamine sensitivity. You're not clearing dopamine properly when you have a spike, so it's sort of sticking around and downregulating that system. And then both dopamine and serotonin are involved in plasticity in the brain in a way that's going to allow you to shift away from negative thoughts and back into a more kind of fluid state where you can just move on and get on with your life rather than getting stuck in the past. So things that promote neuroplasticity as well as things that help with methylation can all funnel into that. But if you have an issue with rumination, methylation is a really good place to start because it hits that pathway on multiple levels.
Makes so much sense, everything you just said. The within the people who I've worked with up to this point, the highest homocysteine levels that I've ever seen in my life are often the ones who have the strongest of fear responses, who have the strongest rumination, who, when you see it, like, it's often like a retreat that housebound many times. And it does really create that cycle, doesn't it? Where the rumination, the anxiety, all this stuff, it continues. And then if you have a component of maybe MCAS like I did, then every single food and adding it in, especially after like a biofilm incident of what I went through with the reactions to everything. And I even remember one time I had pineapple and I was out for like 4 days after. So every single time, like that stuff compounds, and in a way, it would compound really aggressively for me because I had anaphylactic shock when I was 5 years old and almost died from eating pizza after an allergist said, like, hey, this is okay. So you can get into like these very deep psychological loops. And I know for me, like a very centerpiece of my own healing journey was learning how to like actually eat these foods again. And that ultimately is where I was like, okay, I'm not ruminating as much, and I'm actually able, like when I do my nervous system things even, like I feel like it's so much easier to just get into that. And in a way, it was just this process of I want to get into alignment, and my goal was to get into alignment with whatever my goals are and whatever God's will is for my life. And it's from a stance of courage rather than fear this time. And every time I'm knocked off the road, yeah, I'm able to get back on, but it's much easier this time because I'm able to eat these healthy, nourishing foods, and I'm able to do these things that promote my health each and every day. And that's why even somebody who has like these genetic predispositions to certain things, like if you allow fear to dictate the road that you take to obviously helping out or doing whatever with that, then yeah, it could come to light. But when you allow courage to run the show, it can be a very different outcome. And that's why I also think that if you do let things like fear run the show, or you let things like complacency or frustration or whatever it might be, if that runs the show, our minds can often go to a place of what supplement can I take right now to alleviate this? It can go to like that sort of place. And I think that vitamin D is probably one of my favorite things to talk about, where somebody's like, why can't I just supplement it? Like, I have this busy career and I'm doing my day-to-day thing right now, and I see all these people with their shirt off in the afternoon, and I'm just trying to do my career. And even though I obviously have very light skin, no worries. Like, I'm not going to do the 15 minutes. What are people getting from the actual sunlight and sun exposure that they wouldn't be getting from like a supplement?
Right. So there's some different aspects of this. One is that vitamin D, it's one compound, but even the way we typically talk about it, there's multiple kind of forms that can be measured, even on blood work. You know, you have activated forms, inactivated forms. And the process of going from UV light to vitamin D is something that has a lot more steps than people think. It's not just oh, you've got some precursor, bam, UV light hits it, and now it's vitamin D. Now it's ready to go. It's more than that. There's a reaction that cholesterol undergoes. From that cholesterol derivative, you have three different points that branch off, and only one of those leads to vitamin D. The other one is like lumenserol and one other one. And we don't even know what these lumenserol and other derivatives do in the same way that we know what vitamin D does. I mean, they've been researched somewhat. They have immune system modulating effects, but we don't understand really how much UV light kind of carries these different pathways versus what just a vitamin D supplement does. The other thing is that it's sort of been suggested that water-soluble sulfated forms of vitamin D, which can sort of reach tissue in a different way, might not be created to the same extent when you take the fat-soluble supplement form, because a lot of these precursors also go down these sort of more sulfated, water-soluble pathways that are going to have a different effect. And so there's a lot to be said with that. Something that you see a lot is that people will take a vitamin D supplement and their blood level won't actually change. And this is because the body is very resistant to vitamin D supplementation in a way that's not with sunlight. I think when you have exposure to UVB light, midday sun, let's say 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. or a little bit of a wider window than that, that UV light exposure is going to give you not only these analogs and derivatives, but it's also going to allow your body to kind of choose how much vitamin D it wants to make. And it's going to do that based on other factors like calcium metabolism. That said, vitamin D is really beneficial. You know, I think that it's sort of a thing where I would rather have someone not be deficient, but I think you just won't see the same results. Like, I think your blood level might not go up, or I think if it does, you might see other kind of things skew, like you might see serum calcium rise if you start megadosing it. So I think that vitamin D doses analogous to what you get in food aren't a substitute for light, but they do get you some of the way there. But that sunlight is such a simple intervention. I mean, really what you're talking about, 15, 20 minutes, that's enough for most people. And that doesn't refer to full body exposure. That refers to like forearms and shorts. Like, that's literally so easy to get just from like standing outside on your lunch break at work or something like that. It's like a busy life isn't an excuse not to spend 20 minutes outside. It's just at that point, it's some degree of just complacency. So that's one thing. The outdoor light has a few other components that really are underrated or underappreciated. I think a lot of people focus on the color spectrum, but the brightness of light is just as important. I mean, if you look at like what most people do, they don't turn the lights on. They just sort of have like a window open or something during the day. That light is 10 to 100 times less bright than what you're going to get with direct midday sun. And if you were to just go outside, the fact that your eyes have to adjust and things like that, that's a sign that you're experiencing a level of brightness that you would never experience throughout the entire day inside. And what most people do is when the sun sets, they turn on all the lights, they suddenly like light up the whole house, they have the bright artificial lights. And that's basically creating a reverse circadian rhythm entrainment that's telling you, hey, it's now noon. And when you're going to bed at 2 a.m., it's like no wonder, because you've been blasting yourself with more bright light than you were getting all day when the sun was actually up outside. So it makes it more difficult for people to fall asleep when the sun sets. It makes it more difficult for people to actually kind of relax and unwind in the evening. And bright light is also a stimulus for this excitation of glutamate and cortisol in the same way that most people may not even realize. I mean, when we hear things like flashing light or bright light can cause an epileptic seizure, epilepsy is like the textbook hyperglutamate state. It's like an example of glutamate that runs away with itself so much that you lose control of your kind of coherent nerve impulses. And that's something that light can trigger just as much in you or I, but we don't experience it to the same degree. So we sort of write it off. But that's something that really you need to be aware of. And infrared light is a whole other thing that we can get into probably for an hour on its own. But it has so many interesting mechanisms, particularly, I think, UV light to some extent, like you could say UV light is a proxy nutrient for vitamin D, like UV light itself could be considered a vitamin or a nutrient. But infrared light especially, I think, doesn't have a good proxy in what it does in biology to the point where it should be considered a nutrient, because infrared light is something that, with sort of the traditional way humans were living up until very recently, we wouldn't have been able to go outside throughout the day without getting infrared light. And even if you were in the shade, in like a forest environment, something like that, the infrared light content of light is still very high relative to the other frequencies. So it would have been constant daily exposure, even outside of things like bright light or UV light. Infrared was always present. And we've only now managed to sequester ourselves in such a way that infrared light isn't present. And most of all, I consider infrared light to be the fundamental anti-hypoxia factor in biology, because it does multiple things that promote the acceptance of oxygen within mitochondria. So oxygen itself actually exists in a state that's kind of unusual from a chemistry standpoint, where even though it's sort of a stable molecule, two of its electrons are unpaired. This is called a triplet state. And normally you'd see this in like kind of unusual free radical states, but in oxygen, it's the most stable configuration. And when infrared light hits your body and penetrates into your tissue, even several inches into your body, or it can penetrate into the brain through the skull, you see this shift from the triplet state into the electrons actually pairing up again with what's known as a singlet state. And singlet oxygen is much more reactive and conducive to different reactions than the triplet state. So singlet oxygen, for example, it binds more readily to hemoglobin, and it binds more readily to other heme proteins, which are things like the electron transport chain. Complex 4 has this heme protein core that's the acceptor for oxygen. So mitochondria can't accept oxygen into the electron transport chain without it being in that singlet state. And the structure of heme is configured in a way that kind of pushes it in that direction, but infrared light pushes it even further, and it kind of takes it the rest of the way to literally increase the respiratory rate. If we shine infrared light on cells, we see that they make more ATP just in like a tissue culture dish. And that's really fascinating because our cells do the same thing, and infrared light penetrates very well into our body, more than pretty much any other frequency in sunlight. The other thing that it does that's really interesting is it interacts with nitric oxide in a way. I've coined a term for this called nitric oxide pooling. This is basically when nitric oxide is released, and there can be different reasons for this, but one of the main cases that you see with disease is inflammation actually causes nitric oxide to be released. There's a specific enzyme that makes nitric oxide called INOS, I-N-O-S. And this is what endotoxin, bacterial toxins produced in the gut, infection systemically, and other inflammatory stimulus that's not related to infection all elevate INOS. And the interesting thing is that INOS produces, I think it's 10 times or like exponentially more nitric oxide than any other nitric oxide producing enzyme. So in this context, it takes on a completely different reaction than what it's doing when it's just dilating the blood vessels, what we hear about it with things like arginine supplements or taking Viagra or things like that target nitric oxide. It's all about circulation and dilating blood vessels. But in this context, it actually can have negative effects where nitric oxide can form free radicals. And it can also actually bind in the same heme site as oxygen and inhibit respiration and inhibit oxygen from binding in that same site. So infrared light has this very interesting ability to actually dissociate nitric oxide from protein. When nitric oxide pooling occurs, whereas nitric oxide itself is only active for a short period of time, like maximum a second or two, but even in most cases milliseconds, typically it's sort of being created and broken down very quickly, but it can react with a bunch of different sites and proteins. It's more than 50% of proteins in the body have binding sites that can bind nitric oxide in a way that ranges in stability, but in some cases you could potentially see minutes or hours of stable nitric oxide saturation in proteins. And especially when inflammation is present, these proteins are constantly being saturated with nitric oxide. Now, the interesting thing is that bond between nitric oxide and protein can break in several ways. And the two kind of ways that it can break is either it converts to a disulfide bond, which is the protein then binds to another protein. That can cause sort of aggregation and accumulation of different proteins in the body. In some cases, it's just part of normal structure. In other cases, it might be a negative thing that causes disorganized clumping that can be difficult for the cell to clear. But the other way that it can break down is through dissociation, where the nitric oxide is removed again, and photocatalytic dissociation, where light hits that protein and causes that bond to be energized enough to break, is one of the most common and easy ways to do this. So if you don't have enough infrared light, and if you're in an inflammatory state, if you have a lot of this tissue nitric oxide being produced, you'll actually get this buildup within tissue, and it causes even negative feedback loops where circulatory nitric oxide levels will be reduced because your body thinks you're so saturated that you don't need more, even though it's not in the bloodstream where it belongs. And infrared light, beyond just its effects on oxygen itself, can directly dissociate that nitric oxide, allow it to be cleared. And over time, if you're doing this regularly, you're going to be in a state that's smoother metabolism as a result of not having these different pathways activated, not having any interference with mitochondrial oxygen usage, and having nitric oxide moving back into the bloodstream actually causes those blood vessels to dilate, and you get better circulation to that tissue to prevent the same thing from happening again. So it's tuning cells in a way that is the same way that a vitamin or something like magnesium would. And it's doing it through direct modification of chemical bonds. And there's probably even more examples of this that I haven't even mapped out yet. But this is kind of what I'm moving toward as far as like infrared light as one of the most fundamental factors in biology.
I think I literally wrote an article one time on my Substack that was like, infrared light is the nutrient 99% of everyone is missing. And it's really fascinating because, like you said, it's just like sort of a modern day conundrum that's sort of an aside to our like visual ability to see it as a problem. Because for many people, I mean, light's just a means to see something. But when you kind of go down that circadian biology rabbit hole that was introduced to me actually initially by a guy named Ryan Carter, you kind of begin to see like, oh man, like there's all these intricacies on every biochemical level from just a light input. That's a downstream effect from that. And so you're starting to marry these different discussions of like biochem with things like, you know, your foods you eat through the Krebs cycle into the respiratory chain with how light influences these things, as well as like for me, I had systemic neuropathy. And so for me, a big discussion up front from the very beginning was, okay, circulation's part of this picture. I don't know what's going wrong with mine, but when I kind of went down that infrared light rabbit hole, I was like, oh my gosh, there's like all this stuff around NO2 and like all these issues probably with like the superficial space being dehydrated and having all these substrates too close together, irritating the nerves. And so light's just like this endless rabbit hole that nothing else in the world has to deal with besides us, because we live in these like cage zoos with LEDs. And if you're in a hospital, good luck, because they're all fluorescent. So like good luck healing in that environment. But what's really fascinating me too, and there's like a whole separate discussion we could go down the rabbit hole of probably another time, with UV light and things like POMC and those sort of like precursor peptide hormones that are so important for, I mean, alpha MSH, but also like beta endorphin, I believe, and then ACTH, which of course, ties in with the whole cortisol picture that people like to talk about online all the time about, but ignore like these precursor steps to even get to cortisol being a dysregulation to begin with. And so it's just like light in of itself is just a rabbit hole. But what I'm more curious about is bringing these converging rabbit holes together into a picture, because you've written a lot about all of these things separately, but also together. And that's where I think the context makes a beautiful baby that's just magic. And so you've written around like electron states. You've written about electron states, for example. You've written about light and mitochondria. Could you maybe explain how, like, in your mind, these concepts sort of come together to shape overall health, or like building blocks to that health, and how you sort of like take the compartmentalization and then combine them into one ethos? Because I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up, is they can kind of go down a rabbit hole and then they're like, well, I don't know how that goes together with this other picture of my biochemistry.
Yeah, I think to some extent everything interacts with everything else, but
right.
I see it as this convergence of pathways. And like, if I had to summarize it simply, the pathways would be something like the excitation by calcium activation, this cellular stress response, or activation to the point of like fatigue without proper inhibitory balance. That contributes to inflammation, where you're going to have like histamine release and things like that. That can affect circulation. You can get hypoxia because, among other things, the histamine can cause swelling. You can have the nitric oxide release. That can even affect breathing. I mean, elevated nitric oxide, one of the symptoms is that your sinuses become congested. It causes that dilation and the swelling in the nasal passage that can cause like mouth breathing, and you get this sort of dysregulation of like CO2 to O2 ratio that's involved in actually like offloading that oxygen into tissue. And then over time you get basically this state where things that should be solubilized are actually deposited off into tissue. So you have things like calcium phosphate crystal and other phosphate crystals that are deposited in different places in the body. Within the circulatory system, we know this is arterial calcification, and it sort of solidifies plaque and makes it more difficult to clear. In some sense, it's almost protective because it makes the risk of like stroke or clotting less problematic, but it also causes that to become more of a long-term issue. So if you can prevent that and plaque deposition, that's also important. But also we see this in the brain. There's something called brain sand or corporea arenacea, which is basically these deposition of these phosphate crystals in neural tissue, and it causes the sort of inflammation. These proteins aggregate around it in a way that can cut off microcirculation to different regions of the brain. And we know this in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's is like the tau and the amyloid plaques. That's what this is referring to, is this protein aggregation. But this can also cut off circulation in different organs. And we see basically this calcification and these other kind of mineral deposits occur in other organs as well. I mean, they occur in the thyroid, in the kidneys. They can reduce kind of kidney function, so you don't get the proper clearance of different electrolytes and other factors. And another thing that really plays a big role in this is that when metabolism being dysregulated in these different ways, you also see a lot of the time that's paired with consumption of excess calories. So the hypercaloric consumption paired with like a state of malnutrition where you're lacking these minerals and vitamins, that causes things like visceral fat to accumulate in the organs. And then you see this broader dysregulation where now the liver's fatty, so it's going to produce more of the LDL particles that contribute to plaque. And you see fat accumulate in the pancreas, and the fats themselves are what interferes with the insulin receptor and causes insulin resistance. And so now you're not responding to insulin properly, and your blood glucose stays elevated, or you're more prone to spikes and crashes. And that elevated blood glucose just contributes to more protein damage through advanced glycation products and other things like that directly kind of damage the veins and arteries. And another thing that's just an end product of all this is permeability. the sort of damage that occurs to blood vessels, to the blood-brain barrier from high levels of inflammatory signaling factors, high levels of homocysteine, some of these other kind of products. It causes permeability that literally causes leakage of water and solutes and things like that into the space between cells. You get swelling and edema. You get less sort of circulation and more buildup of fluid in the wrong places. And this all ties into itself in numerous different ways. I mean, you could draw the line from any one of these things to another one, and you'd say, well, swelling in the brain actually can cause calcification, because like one of the ways they believe pineal calcification occurs is that it's actually pressure toward the cells in the pineal gland that causes stem cell activation, that then they convert more into almost bone-like cells versus the pineal gland cells. And so that's caused by swelling and blood-brain barrier disruption, but that's caused by the circulation of these different things in the bloodstream that are kind of free radical damage and homocysteine and things like that. So in some sense, it's a web of factors, but I think with a web, any string that you cut is going to weaken the web. And the more strings that you can cut are going to weaken the entire system until you're able to bring it down to a point of function again. And so in some cases, this can be simple. Like when it comes to the visceral fat, there's studies showing that losing 5 or 10 pounds can be enough to bring down HbA1c and fasting blood glucose. And that might be enough to cause kind of a reduction for the next few years if you're able to maintain that in the damage from glucose. And now the permeability starts to be reduced. Similarly, with the calcification, things like vitamin D and light exposure, vitamin D, magnesium, vitamin K, these things antagonize the hormones that promote calcification. And magnesium itself actually has been found to solubilize calcium deposits and actually make them sort of break down and dissolve back into the bloodstream and into the fluid. And so there's almost a lot of ways you can come at it, but it comes down to these fundamental materials. So for example, magnesium targets so many of these systems. It can promote the insulin sensitivity in the pancreas. It can improve solubility. It can prevent the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, and it can reduce the calcium activation that causes a lot of this like inflammatory response and stress response in cells. And things like inositol is really excellent for glucose sensitivity as well. It helps to propagate the signal that's put out by the insulin receptors. And it also acts as what's called a lipotrope, where it can bind fat that's visceral fat in the pancreas and the liver and actually solubilize it and remove it from that organ. And so it might even be able to play a role in reversing fatty liver and things like that. And on top of that, inositol can bind to calcification deposits and disrupt their continued growth. And it can actually basically act as a shield that prevents calcification from progressing. And so there's a lot of these different factors, infrared light, magnesium, different B vitamins. I mean, they all play their own role in this. Fiber in the diet can play a big role in just preventing some of this inflammatory response by relieving calcification and preventing that excess permeability in the digestive system. And then I think herbs play some role in this as well. Like with the herbs that we commonly consume, flavonoids are a big class of compounds that are found in both fruits and vegetables, citrus juices, as well as some of the different herbs that I always talk about, like skullcap. These flavonoids have very potent antihistamine and anti-inflammatory effects, and they can also reduce a lot of these different responses. Plus, they act as antioxidants that can prevent damage to the blood vessels that promote this permeability, and they can have even direct effects on the GABA receptors. In the case of things like apigenin and chamomile or bicolin and skullcap, these are directly kind of anxiety relieving compounds. So all of it kind of plays in, but I'd say there's starting points for sure. The things we've talked about with magnesium, with infrared light exposure, exercise, is excellent for all of these systems. Grounding helps play a role through that sort of nerve stimulation and electric conduction, other things like that that can actually directly lower stress and blood pressure. And then just sort of eating a diet that's going to promote more of a stable regulation of blood sugar and provide you the nutrients that you need, focusing on nutrient dense foods that make you feel full and provide fiber and protein and minerals and different things like that. All of this kind of works together, and then you can fine tune it with specific herbs or things like that that you react well to, and that can kind of fill in the gaps. So it's a lot, it seems like in some cases insurmountable to just start with this process. But I think anything that you start with in this realm of like well tolerated, broad acting kind of materials, they can all get you to the same place in the end. And it's just a matter of finding what you tolerate, finding what's accessible. If you can start with one thing, make it magnesium. If you can start with two things, magnesium, sunlight, you can add in some exercise if that's something you tolerate. And over time, you can sort of build up to this point where you're able to kind of feel good again on a daily basis.
That was awesome. When you were saying all of that, I was like, he's talking about the, obviously the solutes and the fluid, interstitial space. I've been working with a lot of people with neuropathy recently. So when you talked about that concept, I was like, yep, that's a big one right there. You really want to make sure that red blood cell volume and perfusion is good. And there's a lot that just goes into our physiology where you can look at somebody's blood panel and you'll be like, oh, bicarbonate 20. There's a story happening right here. And you could look at that and you could be like, oh, acidosis. Or you could think like, oh, well, the body's pretty good at trying to maintain this thing called homeostasis. And obviously with the cell, maybe there's that pH gradient and maybe there's the charge gradient too that it's really thinking about with the bloodstream and all those areas of physiology as well. I know for one point for me in my journey, when I was really going through things, and there was a point where, when I figured this one out, I thought I gained like 20 IQ points after. I was really getting into blood chemistry and got my panel and I was checking it out and I was getting into like more functional blood chemistry and I saw my ferritin and it was at like 650. My percent saturation was over like 45%. I think it was like 55. Serum iron high, pretty low total iron binding capacity. Went to a doc and whatnot. They're like, nope, we're not even going to think about hemochromatosis. Like off the table, don't even worry about it. And I'm like, I don't know about that one. I think that there's like a reasonable argument here. I don't think that I'm being unreasonable. So I'm going to ask around. And Grimhood was actually one of the people who I actually spoke to a lot about this. And we were just looking over, obviously, my genes and everything. And we saw that I had carrier status for it. And my health had essentially, the idea is that my health might have essentially hit a point where, paired with potentially genes that set me up for a bad Fenton reaction and obviously a lot of hydroxyl radical production, I was running into issues with getting like this high ferritin. And in the picture as well, there is also like this history of long COVID too. So probably a lot of different ingredients in the soup, realistically speaking, to say like all hemochromatosis maybe, but carrier status, so who really knows for sure. But the greater question really is, when you're really going through health with somebody, I think that copper iron metabolism, especially depending on the way that your genetics are laid out and some of the things that you might be predisposed to, and perhaps the environment that one could be into, what would be like some of the main focal points of the nuances of copper iron metabolism that you would want somebody on a healing journey to like really understand?
Yeah, so this is another thing that kind of plays into a lot of the different areas of like how disease progresses that we've talked about. So I think there's a balance here between two extremes. So on one extreme, you have anemia, which is one of the main causes of hypoxia. You don't have enough in many cases just production of red blood cells, or the red blood cells that you're producing are deficient in hemoglobin, or they're otherwise structurally kind of non-optimal. They're too large with very little hemoglobin per cell, or they're very small and dense, or things like that. And those can all be causes of anemia. It's not necessarily iron deficiency. It can be anywhere in the process of you consuming these nutrients, iron and other nutrients, all the way to those nutrients making their way to your bone marrow where red blood cells are being created, whether everything for that recipe is present in such a way that's going to cause that to kind of come together properly, or whether things are missing different ingredients in that process that are then going to cause red blood cell function to be impaired. And really, so many causes of mental health, especially in women, are blamed on iron deficiency when you do have those symptoms because of anemia, but there's diverse causes for that anemia. The other extreme is that you'll have cases like hemochromatosis is just the most kind of clear, obvious example where excess iron is contributing to aging. And this is like widely accepted in aging research. It's sort of not mainstream, but if you search this, there's papers that basically say iron is the main cause of neurodegeneration, or iron is the main cause of inflammatory disorders or fatty liver disease or things like that. And there's people that have spent their entire careers mapping out the ways that iron imbalances in cells contribute to these different diseases of aging. And the reason this occurs, you mentioned the Fenton reaction. What this basically is a reaction between iron that's in a free, non-protein bound, soluble form that reacts with hydrogen peroxide to produce a type of free radical. Hydrogen peroxide itself behaves as a free radical, but it produces a much more potent free radical called a hydroxyl radical. And this is the most potent free radical that occurs in the human body. It's extremely reactive, and it basically takes away any distinction between, oh, these are easily broken down, oxidized molecules, and these molecules are pretty stable. It can target pretty much any structure you can imagine. And the more you break down these different protein structures, the more you'll typically see inflammatory response. This is how autoimmunity occurs, is that you'll have breakdown of what should be normal kind of protein structures into something that looks like a normal protein structure but is wrong in some way, has free radical property or broken chemical bonds, and it creates basically things that the immune system tags as antigens in a way that causes it to be kind of creating inflammatory responses to your own body. And to resolve this, a lot of the time you need to get to the root source of those free radicals, and in many cases that's excess iron being accumulated. You see a lot with hemochromatosis, you see a lot of accelerated diseases of aging. You see accelerated heart disease, you see accelerated hair loss even. There's all of these factors that are basically pushed forward, but you have to sort of imagine that those same disease processes would occur over many years just with the normal kind of accumulation of iron that occurs at a very slow rate throughout life. And there's ways around this, and there's all sorts of different nutrients that target it. So if we look at the end of the spectrum, which is that you're not using iron properly to make red blood cells, and because of that, you're not getting the oxygen that your brain and body needs in every tissue all the time. If you look at it from that perspective, the most important cofactor for iron is copper. Both iron and copper are what are called transition metals. So they basically have what you can consider a flexible electron state. The transition metals, they have their outer electrons in what's known as a d orbital, which is basically it has a wide range of electron states that it can be in. In some cases, this is as extreme as like a +10 state all the way down to a -2 state as far as the charge that mineral can contain or possess at a given time. And that just depends on the amount of electrons it has. And because this d orbital is so wide, it has a lot of stable electron states that can occur along a gradient within it. So with copper and iron, the two states that they each possess most commonly, with iron, it's a +2 state or a +3 state. And with copper, it's a +2 state or a +1 state. And so they each have this sort of binary flexibility that's most commonly seen, where they can easily switch back and forth by accepting or donating electrons. And Because of this, biology has coupled them together in order to switch those two states in both of them simultaneously. So copper gives electrons to iron and accepts electrons from iron in order to switch iron back and forth between +3 and +2. And the reason that this occurs is because +2 is water soluble and +3 is insoluble. And the water soluble +2 form also is charge matched with oxygen, which has a -2 charge in isolation as one kind of atom. And because of that, you have this ability of oxygen to react very well with +2 iron. This is leveraged in heme proteins and hemoglobin. This is the form that it needs to be in the electron transport chain to accept oxygen. But on its own, if you have what's called free or labile iron, where it's just not attached to a protein and it's floating in this kind of pool within the cell, then that will react with oxygen to catalyze these different reactions, and it'll react with hydrogen peroxide to perform a Fenton reaction. So because of this, the body's very careful about only putting iron into the +2 form in sort of brief periods of time when it's not bound to something. And copper is what facilitates that. Every time iron crosses a cell membrane, it's briefly converted into the soluble form, and then it's converted back on the other end into the insoluble form, so that it's sort of chaperoned through every part of the body, from digestive absorption all the way to actually being loaded into hemoglobin and these other kind of processes. So because of that, you need copper and iron to work together. Otherwise, the other kind of cofactors, vitamin C plays an important role through two main pathways. There's an enzyme called duodenyl cytochrome B, and this is basically in the lining of the intestine. This converts iron that you're eating, which can be sort of in a mix of +2 and +3. It converts the +3 iron that you eat into +2. So a lot of the time, anemia is vitamin C deficiency because you aren't absorbing anything but what's already in the +2 form, and you don't have the vitamin C to kind of switch it into a soluble state. The other thing that vitamin C does very well is it works with a similar enzyme called cytochrome B5 reductase. And this enzyme switches oxidized hemoglobin, where the hemoglobin has lost one of those electrons, it's the iron in the +3 form, and it switches it back to the active +2 form so it can be continued to use instead of broken down and kind of turned over. And so vitamin C also protects and prolongs the function of hemoglobin. Now, beyond that, zinc is also required for the pathway that synthesizes new hemoglobin in the bone marrow. And a lot of the time, zinc deficiency, this is not a common kind of cause of anemia and like what most people are aware of, but zinc deficiency can play a role in anemia for that reason, because it prevents hemoglobin from being properly carried out. And when this occurs, like any breakdown in the hemoglobin synthesis chain can cause free iron to be released. So all of these kind of deficiencies can cause free iron to end up in places that it shouldn't be. Beyond that, various B vitamins also play a role. B6, B9, B12 play a role in this. Deficiency in any of those three can cause anemia. You see specific markers with each one, like MCV being elevated with B12, for example. And this is like morphologically, the red blood cells are off in some way, and that's caused by the deficiency of B vitamins. And even B7 is actually involved in the hemoglobin synthesis pathway as well. So any of these vitamins or any of these minerals can play a role in the deficiency of iron that seems like an iron deficiency, but it's really deficiency in iron or any of these other factors. So not to say you can't focus on iron, but iron should be paired with nutrient dense foods that hit these other targets. Like oysters is a great example that are very high in copper and zinc. A little bit of beef liver can provide a lot of copper, vitamin A, which is also important in B vitamins. Or in some cases, finding the B vitamin that you're deficient in and supplementing it can be a night and day difference. When it comes to iron overload, this is something that you see a lot of the time. High ferritin can either be a marker of you've consumed a lot of iron over time, or you're in an inflammatory state. Direct high iron consumption will transiently elevate ferritin. But then if you see ferritin elevated over time, you're either in a constant inflammatory state or you've actually built up that much of a store that your body has this elevated ferritin, and things like hemochromatosis really predispose you to this high ferritin state. And so things like blood donation, different antioxidants that actually pretty much any antioxidant has the ability to bind free metals, glutathione, things like that. They can bind metals and remove them from the body. And different plant-sourced antioxidants, like catechins, for example, in green tea and chocolate, and tannins in coffee, these can form complexes with iron in the digestive system that either reduce its absorption, or if it binds with iron within the body, you also see this tendency of it to remove iron from the body. So some of the cutting edge kind of therapeutics that are being developed for neurodegeneration and these different brain disorders are actually iron binding agents. And we'll see how effectively this can be carried out, because obviously there's a balance between, we don't want to create anemia by having too strong of iron binding. We need them to be lipid soluble enough to reach through the blood-brain barrier and not just be active in the body. There's a lot of kind of particulars that need to be worked out, but I think that we'll see kind of this trajectory carry us into research that will potentially offer better treatments even for disease through specific targeted iron binding in different tissues. So there's a lot of aspects to it, but those are some of the kind of troubleshooting points that you can start with if you find that you're either too high or too low in iron.
That's like the best discussion ever, because one of my favorite topics that you do not learn, by the way, in nutritional therapy school is the real intricacies of this. There's a great image of like the mineral web you can just find on like Google Images of like, this one can upregulate this one, and that will downregulate this one, and they all interact through this. And that, like you said, I find that very true. Like we have a lot of clients that have, let's just put it like in a very nice way, I'll put a bow on it, their iron is crap. And there's a lot of intricacies to that, because the blatant answer that we get all the time from them is like, oh, I can just take like iron bisglycinate and it's fine. And it's like, no, we need to like literally assess the whole system here, because like you mentioned things like elevated MCV for like B12 and then vitamin C. And that's actually the big one I see a lot, is like people are just not getting enough vitamin C to even uptake these things in the first place in some cases. So it's really learning, like you, and I love that you threw zinc in there too, because that's sort of an under discussed one in the iron picture. But it's really learning about how do all of these things, you said earlier, sort of everything affects everything all the time. That's my like general philosophy when it comes to health. And so when someone asks me a question, I understand sort of the reductionism in their question because of just lack of nuance and understanding. But I have to like big old stop sign there and be like, all right, we got to work it back, because the problem started way over here, not like right here. And
right. So, you got to start with the basics.
Yeah. And so one of the topics that I know Chris definitely wanted to discuss on here, but I also find fascinating when you're talking about restoring energy balance, is sort of this relationship with connecting thiamine and CO2. And I know you've talked about this. So I'd love for you to maybe explain this in maybe the simplest terms of the mechanism for someone maybe just kind of getting into this, reading into these things, but that's a fascinating jump.
Yeah. So this is something that I haven't seen too much discussion of.
Like none. I think you're like one of the only people I've ever really seen talk about it.
There's specific aspects of thiamine involvement that I think I've specifically pioneered. The CO2 thing is mentioned a little bit by Ray Peat. He touches on it pretty briefly. He just sort of mentions that among other nutrients like biotin, that thiamine is one of the things that produces CO2 via the specific enzymes that it interacts with. But the entire kind of picture here, I think it's me and Ray Peat that have really mapped this out. And there's some interesting aspects of it. So to kind of lay some groundwork, CO2 is one of my favorite kind of molecules. I've really been interested in what are called the gasotransmitters, or the basically like things that are gases if you took them outside the body, but within the body, they're sort of soluble gases that have different effects. So like we talked about nitric oxide and nitric oxide pooling earlier, and kind of how that affects all these different aspects of physiology. Nitric oxide is also a gas. So the reason it mimics oxygen is because it's so similar in structure that in the air, it's going to behave as a gas. So CO2 is another one that is very interesting. It's structurally sort of similar to oxygen, except in the middle of that structure, there's a carbon atom that bridges the two. So it's carbon double bonded to two oxygens. And it has some interesting kind of properties that arise from that. So in chemistry, there's something called a carboxyl group, which is basically it's a carbon attached to a broader structure like a protein, and then it's got two oxygens within it. And this is present in a lot of the time in acids because you can have a proton that's bound to one of the oxygens, or a hydrogen atom, I should say. And when you lose that proton, part of that hydrogen atom, that extra electron can sort of resonate or bounce between the two oxygens, and you get this free proton that's released more easily because of that. And so because of this, when we talk about amino acids, fatty acids, they all have this carboxyl group somewhere in the structure. And reactions in the body either add carboxyl groups or they cleave carboxyl groups and remove them. And that actually releases CO2 gas, basically, within the body. So thiamine has this specific kind of motif in its structure called an ylide, which allows basically that carbon atom to be released more easily in the form of like the carboxyl group. And so thiamine is actually a cofactor. And in one of my kind of labs for school, I actually used thiamine as a cofactor for a reaction outside of like biochem stuff, where it was just basically a carbon removing reaction where just thiamine hydrochloride was dissolved in the solution as a catalyst for this reason. And so this is like a broad chemical property of thiamine, and it's used in the body in different ways. So the interesting thing is that every major thiamine kind of dependent enzyme or pathway that I've looked at releases CO2 either directly or indirectly in the form of something like formate, which then converts to CO2. So either way, you get to CO2 in the end, but basically it's these carbon oxygen kind of groups that are cleaved off by thiamine. And because of this, you have this interesting interplay where it has the most ability to regulate CO2 production in tissue directly, because without it, you can't kind of have CO2 release. So why does that matter? CO2 has a few interesting properties. One is that it sort of buffers back and forth between CO2 and bicarbonate. And there's an intermediate called carbonic acid. So this is basically the CO2 turns into a carboxyl group in this simple structure. And so it has this acidic property by turning into that carboxyl group and releasing protons. And bicarbonate has the opposite effect, where it accepts protons. And so there's constantly this shift back and forth that is the main way that your body buffers acidity and prevents excess acidity from developing. So CO2 itself kind of has an acidic property. And because of this, it has some different interesting effects. It actually dilates blood vessels. But the other thing is that it can actually complex directly with hemoglobin in a way that sort of opens up the hemoglobin core ring and causes oxygen to be released from it. So this is the main marker of what's known as tissue hypoxia or histological hypoxia, where basically you'll have a high oxygen saturation in the blood, but you'll have a low CO2 saturation in the blood. And so this basically causes the blood to be overly alkaline, and you don't see the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. So it's sort of like you're stuck on the train and you can't get off, and it's just going around and around and around. And that can actually cause hypoxia independent of oxygen level. The other thing is you see sort of the opposite effect, where high levels of oxygen will be enough to displace CO2, and that has the opposite effect in your lungs. So the two should be constantly interchanging. But if your tissue oxygen is sort of saturated, but your CO2 isn't being produced by tissue, then you see this problem start to occur. Now, we're sort of taught in school, like you breathe in oxygen, you breathe out CO2. And this is like basic physiology. So a lot of people assume that like the main byproduct of oxygen in metabolism is CO2. That's actually not the case. Oxygen is split into water by the electron transport chain. Most of our metabolism of oxygen goes through that pathway. And so water is our main metabolic byproduct. CO2 is produced by glycolysis particularly. So things that promote carbohydrate metabolism, like increased thyroid function, having the cofactors for glycolysis, different things like that, higher carbohydrate consumption, those will actually tend to increase CO2. And similarly, things that sort of inhibit glycolysis, like cortisol and things like that, will tend to reduce CO2. And so the interesting kind of way that all of this comes together is that more thiamine seems to directly increase CO2 through the mechanism we talked about. It's a cofactor for all of these enzymes, including the end step of glycolysis, where pyruvate feeds into the Krebs cycle. That bridge is called pyruvate dehydrogenase, and it's sort of the biggest enzyme that vitamin B1 or thiamine is a cofactor for, and that releases CO2. But also, thiamine in high doses has this interesting property where it inhibits carbonic anhydrase, which is the enzyme that takes CO2 and shifts it into bicarbonate. So you can sort of keep CO2 more as a gas by taking higher doses of thiamine. And this mimics the mechanism of actually altitude sickness drugs like acetazolamide. Acetazolamide is actually similar in potency as a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor to thiamine. So it's possible that we see this sort of divergence where high doses of thiamine actually take on this additional property of maintaining CO2 retention. And for a lot of people, that might be resolving hypoxia. And then it also supports this pathway of glycolysis very potently through this kind of pyruvate dehydrogenase axis. A really interesting way to actually measure this is you can get a lactate meter. And in some cases especially where you see this bottleneck in the B1 pathways, lactate will be elevated. Because if pyruvate can't be fed into the Krebs cycle, it can still be metabolized into lactate through anaerobic glycolysis. And that still has some positive effects, still produces some energy, but it's going to elevate lactate. And so if you have high lactate and you take B1, especially in high doses, lactate will come down. If the bottleneck is somewhere else, it won't necessarily do that, but this is the most kind of clear established way of seeing what happens between those two. The other really interesting thing that I think I've really been the one to map this out the most is that thiamine behaves very similar to ATP in how its active forms function. So the active form of thiamine that's typically considered a cofactor for these reactions isn't just thiamine, it's thiamine diphosphate, where thiamine has two phosphates added to it. And this, interestingly, is very similar in structure to the main byproduct of ATP called adenosine diphosphate. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. There's a form of thiamine that's produced in some tissues in very significant quantities called thiamine triphosphate that has the same 3-phosphate kind of structure as ATP. And when we talk about something like creatine works as a sort of energy reservoir by donating phosphate groups to ATP. When it sort of loses those phosphates, it puts it back up into the form of ATP. It's possible that thiamine can do the same thing. The other thing that's really interesting with thiamine triphosphate is it seems to act as a neurotransmitter. We see it being released by neurons within the brain, and it probably has other properties that we don't fully understand. So there's some really interesting stuff with thiamine's sort of active phosphate forms that, to me, might explain why something like high doses of thiamine has different effects for different people, more so than just like eating it from food would. And I think this is sort of a route that might be useful for something like pharmaceutical development or other therapeutics, because the active forms of thiamine could behave very differently if you were to take them as a supplement than just thiamine hydrochloride could. So there's a lot there, but I think that it's extremely interesting to explore.
Absolutely incredible. Well, I remember with thiamine, that was one of the ones where when I was earlier on in my journey, I found TTFD, and I started taking that, and very interestingly enough, like toward the beginning, just carbohydrate digestion, tolerating it, getting blood sugar spikes, and that obviously coinciding with like these histamine MCAS issues. It's not the most fun thing. And when I found TTFD, I noticed when I took it at higher doses, I'm like, wow, it's kind of acting like a nootropic in a way. I feel very good up in my head right now. But this last question is very personal to me because when I was going through my health journey, and it was obviously it started in childhood where I had these life-threatening food allergies, very severe asthma, eczema from head to toe, and it was the 40 plus throughs the foods with the food allergies, so it was difficult to kind of live normal life. Like if I have like pet dogs and whatnot, I would hive up and everything. So from a young age, I was like, I'm gonna do med school, and it's gonna be awesome, and I'm gonna get to help people. And when I was at the point of undergraduate, I was a pre-med, and I went through it. And I always say, after doing like 300 hours of shadowing, with every like hour after that, I was like, okay, I might want to like rethink this. And it really did get to the point where I went through obviously so many physicians when I was just vomiting stomach acid. And it could have been from like this long COVID thing during the time I had the high ferritin, but one of the final straws for me was when I saw that my eosinophils were at 3,000 at the time. And nothing was said with the ferritin 650, and I'm like, I really want to like figure this out and see like what's going on. Like it seems like there's a lead there. But I say all of that because after I went through the whole process and started to make more progress than anything with walking to the library to study for my MCAT while the sun was rising, reading a lot of Grimhood's Patreon stuff, getting in the X community and all of that, fixing my diet up, prioritizing nutrition with the foods that I could have, doing things to calm the nervous system. I saw these things and I was like, this has made me more progress than any doctor and also any naturopath that I've gone to at this point. So at that point, I was like, I'm just gonna put the medical thing on hold. I'm not gonna do anything crazy, but I do feel this strong pull to not go toward obviously medicine for me. And at the time, I was like, I did all of this stuff. Like I'm gonna go into medicine, and like really, like I feel this intuitive pull to like do this after all these years of hard work, but it had to be done. And I got a master's in medical nutrition instead. And what really changed the game for me in terms of research and thinking more deeply and getting nuanced was I had a professor, and while I do think that all dietary philosophies have their merits in certain circumstances where they can be a tool even, I did have a professor who was very biased toward veganism. Like it was pretty obvious when you were going through the course. And I was like, you know what? We're going to talk about food production systems. And that is when I went on just an all-out deep dive on this sort of topic. And got very deep into the whole sort of thing. So that all leads into the question that I'm most excited for. What did modern agriculture change in the biochemical environment that humans are still adapting to? So maybe examples of that are like soil depletion, the fertilizer patterns, calcium phosphorus balance, the arachidonic acid to DHA ratio, the ruminant biology. I guess all those sorts of things. I think that would be a really fascinating way to go through the last sort of question.
Sure. So there's two big areas that I see most with this, and we'll just kind of touch on plant agriculture and animal. So with soil depletion, you kind of mentioned this, but the biggest thing that I see is that monocropping and the way that we are kind of farming is depleting things from the soil for multiple different reasons. One is that we don't have the biodiversity that you have with wild plants in an ecosystem, where there's going to be some plants that put down nitrogen or specific minerals or things into the soil, and there's going to be other plants that take them up, and they sort of share resources through mycorrhizal networks where fungi can actually penetrate even into the root and transport nutrients and informational signals between plants. You don't have this sort of intelligent, coherent design that occurs in nature because we suppress that in different ways. And so different pesticides and herbicides like glyphosate and things like that have this property where they sterilize the soil. They basically kill off bacteria that live symbiotically. They There's compounds that kill off fungal life that live symbiotically. And even outside of that, we have basically an absence of anything besides the one monocrop that we're growing. Beyond that, we actually genetically modify these plants basically to be resistant to these same pesticides like glyphosate to such a degree that we can add more and more exposure to those crops and really just completely sterilize things even more than we were able to before genetic modification was developed. And among other things, the sterilization of the soil depletes bacteria that actually convert these different kind of mineral sources of different minerals like crystals and things like that naturally occur in the soil that would normally be not very bioavailable to the plant. But there's bacteria that can metabolize those kind of complex forms of different minerals and release the free minerals for usage. Those bacteria are killed off. And then fungi and other species that do the same thing are killed off. And then we plant on the same field year after year without any kind of crop rotation or very minimal crop rotation that will actually cause the soil to be depleted of those minerals even further. And so there's a significant loss of minerals in our food. We see in some cases it's 10 to 20%. The one mineral that's increased is phosphorus. So the reason that this occurs is because we're specifically adding phosphorus and nitrogen as fertilizers because they're sort of bare minimum growth stimulus for plants. And so by adding that, we're actually skewing the calcium phosphorus ratio of our food toward phosphorus. And earlier I was talking about calcification and how that's a very important aspect of sort of how aging occurs, where you have these deposits of insoluble crystals that proteins aggregate around that disrupt circulation and sort of impair blood flow. And when this occurs, more often than not, the factor of those two that's elevated in the diet is phosphorus. And specifically, when phosphorus is elevated, the body compensates for it with hormones like parathyroid hormone that pull calcium out of bone in order to counterbalance that phosphorus with calcium. And so you see osteoporosis and calcification strongly correlated with elevated parathyroid hormone. And the biggest kind of symptom or driver of this is elevated phosphate intake. There's a great paper on this topic called Phosphate, a Poison for Humans, that goes through all the mechanisms by which excess phosphate drives kidney disease, heart disease, and calcification in different areas. But really, I think this is one of the core problems of modern agriculture. It's the reason that people need to either focus on very nutrient-dense foods that are specifically high in potassium and trace minerals like zinc, and especially magnesium. But I think there's another side to this coin as well, which is that what we're feeding our animals is completely evolutionarily mismatched. So if you look at ruminant agriculture, what ruminants are fed is actually very carbohydrate heavy and very grain heavy and very heavy in omega-6 fats. And the way that these animals typically metabolize if they live in the wild is they convert fiber into short chain fats, which can then be used for energy. And if there's excess, it can be kind of complex into other longer chain fats in smaller amounts. And so with wild ruminants, they tend to be very lean, something like 5% body fat at the most. And they tend to have a fat profile that's very shifted toward a balance of omega-3, omega-6, and a balance of unsaturated, monounsaturated, and saturated fat that sort of leans more toward a mix of all three or more of the unsaturated fats, at least relative to what we see at the grocery store. And so if you look at modern agriculture in comparison, where it's the ruminants, how they're farmed, they're basically treated in such a way to maximize body fat gain through hypercaloric feeding and through the inclusion of foods that are so carbohydrate heavy that they completely overwhelm the bacterial digestion of their stomach and they go straight to basically caloric input and fat storage. And so these animals are basically obese. I mean, what we're doing to them is promoting obesity through overfeeding of short chain carbohydrates and easily digestible nutrients. And in the process, we end up feeding them a lot of omega-6, which makes the meat high in omega-6 relative to omega-3, but especially high in the main products of de novo lipogenesis, where they're creating their own fat from caloric surplus, which is the long chain saturated fats. And if we look at what these long chain saturated fats do in humans, I mentioned earlier that the accumulation of fat in the liver and in the pancreas is what impairs the insulin receptor sensitivity. It's the long chain saturated fat palmitate specifically that does that. And in humans, this isn't necessarily always dietarily derived, like the degree to which our diet affects this versus just excess calorie consumption affects this. It's a spectrum, and we don't really know where it falls between the two extremes. But I believe it does affect it. And it might be only a 10% effect versus like just consuming a bunch of calories and being obese is like the other 90%. But I think in general, this is not what humans evolved to eat. And the arguments that people make to justify it, things like, oh, we used to hunt woolly mammoths. An elephant is only like 5 to 8% body fat. Like, I don't think you can justify the 20% body fat that we see in farmed beef with anything in nature. And I think even from a standpoint of calorie consumption, fat contains more calories per gram, and it's less satiating to have a higher fat content of meat versus higher protein content. And so I think that what this pushes us toward is high long chain saturated fat consumption, lower consumption of omega-3 fats, short chain fats, which are naturally present more in wild game and have different beneficial anti-inflammatory effects and things like that. And we end up with this sort of mismatch where we're told that this is normal. And there's other things too. I mean, they can inject water into meat when it's processed. It can be up to 20% added water that's injected literally with like an injector with a bunch of needles that are put into the meat and pump water into it. And then we cook it and we're like, wow, there's so much juice in the pan. That's not from the animal. That is like literally put there to add some weight. And for some reason, we make this legal. And then people eat bison or something that was actually able to live a normal life in the wild. And they say, oh, it's so gamey. It doesn't have that.
Yeah, it's gross. It's not fats, and it wasn't beaten before I had it. And all
Right.
that terrible stuff.
Right. And it's to make it more palatable as well. So there's more of a tendency to overconsume something like hamburger when it's really fatty. And so it's a signal that makes us overeat. The fats themselves might disrupt our metabolism to some degree. I mean, we do see that correlation between higher LDL particle count and long chain saturated fat consumption to some extent. And it doesn't mean it's the only factor, but it is worth paying attention to. So trying to get back to like the real way that this food was meant to be created and raised by humans is one of the most important sort of tenets of how I approach food. So wild game, if you're going to eat factory farm meat, make it lean at least, because that's closer to what we are going to kind of consume for the last 100,000 plus years. And the biggest thing that really we're meant to focus on with kind of sourcing these things is if you can meet the person that grew it, or if you can learn about their practices and their philosophies and they align with yours, that's a good way to kind of guide yourself toward what to eat. Is you want to focus on kind of being up close and personal with your food. If you can source locally, if you can grow it yourself, those are the most important things. And this is a spectrum. You know, some of this stuff is a 10% boost, whereas some of the other things we're talking about might be a 50% boost. But it's all important. It all plays a role in how you feel at the end of the day.
Last thing I'll say on this, just because I had an interesting thought come to mind. I did a podcast tour a couple of years ago with a friend of mine on a different show where we interviewed a lot of regenerative ranchers in Wyoming specifically. And we interviewed a nutrition scientist named Stefan Van Fleet at Utah State University in my neck of the woods. And we asked him that very question of like, are we just eating obese cattle? And he was doing research around the actual fatty acid profiles, the chains, and comparing them from grass-fed grain finished to grass-fed grass finished, and mentioned all the things you mentioned and basically corroborated those thoughts. But the other thought that I had an interesting discussion with a regenerative rancher up in Wyoming was just the variety in the amino acid profiles and also probably the fatty acid profiles you get from where those cows were raised. So like when you eat a regeneratively raised cow in Missouri or in Iowa, where you're from, compared to Wyoming, just based on the different foods they're eating. So sage, very heavy in Wyoming, not so much maybe in Iowa, a lot more grasslands. You'll see different profiles. And so you're sort of eating what the land provides. And in that sense, there's this locality to it as well, which I find really fascinating. But also, it was funny talking to this regeneration R.C. Carter up in Wyoming, who he literally just moves them every day. And he said the most challenging aspect of moving cattle is that cattle, like humans, want to eat what they think is tasty. And oftentimes that isn't the grasses that are the non-native grasses that are invading all these other states. And so to try and like bring it back to the soil composition and also just the flora composition that would be more native originally when the bison were running through there, they kind of force feed them to eat these non-native grasses to get rid of them. But that's something that doesn't happen in generic cattle ranching, because in generic ranching, they just do, I think, open grazing where you throw them out there for 6 months, you leave them alone. They're eating whatever they actually want to eat, which involves actually certain levels of the grasses. So cows will eat, like, I think the top layer of the grasses or something like that. And it leaves this other underground that other animals, if you had them grazing there, would kind of finish off. And so it brings up this concept of multi-animal grazing. So like having different animals on the same land, getting different parts of the non-native grasses and stuff like that to get rid of them. And so it's sort of this, you know, relationship and cycles, and it sort of, you have to have the understanding of like all those cycles to make it happen. So I think I like Gabe Brown's work on like soil health is super fascinating to me as well. But I'll let you take this out, Chris. I just wanted to add that in there because like the discussions we've been having with like human physiology, it all goes back to this idea of we're animals on this planet bound by its cycles, and what we've done is just completely destroy the cyclical rhythmic nature of all that. And the reason we have all these problems is actually quite simple. We just don't respect the cycles. And so if we can try to integrate that back to some degree, you know, a lot of things get better. But it's a challenge when you have, 360 million people living in an overconsumption mindset.
Yeah, that's what breeds all this.
Yeah, so it's very fascinating, but really cool discussion. This was fun.
Yeah, I find that I'm a bit of a pattern recognizer. Like the way my brain works is it's always trying to put the things together and make the connections. And one thing that I just noticed, even doing this episode today, is with all of these concepts and topics, there's certainly a way to look at it. And the pattern that I noticed from this podcast is everything that we discuss, there's so much nuance to it. There's so much context. There's so many moving parts that kind of make all of what healing really is, an art and the science, something that kind of it does need these, like obviously the scientific component, it helps us so much as humans, but this understanding of how to weave through the human condition in such a graceful manner, it can be such a beautiful skill that people just work to attain throughout the course of their lives. And that can come from experiences, that can come from our journey that is set in stone for us, that can come from realizing that many times in our lives it's not actually set in stone too. And I guess where this leads me is I want to say that this is just an incredible episode, and thank you so much for coming on, Bryce. And it was such a pleasure to do this. And I view podcasts in a way as timestamps. Like whenever this comes up, it's going to be on there for a good time, and people will watch it. People will come back to it. Maybe like 10 years pass, and who knows what we'll all be doing in 10 years, right?
Right.
So maybe that passes and people are still coming back to this one. But I have a saying that I thought of, and it goes like this: time goes on, but the wisdom will always carry on. So my question to you is, what is the one idea that you want people to walk away from after listening to this episode at any point in time?
I would say that the biggest thing is that health is a coherent process. There are many factors in our lives that create decoherence in that process. And there are many tools that we can use that are agents of coherence that bring us back into this sort of organization across multiple systems that prevents the breakdown that occurs in disease and aging. And learning to incorporate those things might be a lifelong process. It doesn't have to be the only thing you do in your life. It can be something that you study on the side or that you listen to other people on, but there's many tools available, and hopefully I've provided a good starting point for people to do that. But kind of just trying to live the way that our ancestors lived, but also using modern tools to cope with the modern environment is, I think, the best of both worlds. So just trying to kind of bring things back to the point where you have the wherewithal, the state of mind to be able to navigate this modern world, and using the tools that we're given to do that is a good place to start.
Very beautifully said. Very. So for those who are watching this right now, where can people find you?
So I do probably most of my writing on X. My account is photobiogenesis, all one word. I also have a Patreon where I've written, I think, almost 70 long form articles as well that go into a lot more depth with more citation.
A lot of bangers on there.
Yeah. I'm pretty proud of it. I think some of the stuff I've written there is really, really excellent and surpasses stuff I've written anywhere else.
Yes.
So my Patreon is the same, photobiogenesis. I also put my sort of greatest hits, my favorite articles that I've written from my Patreon onto my website publicly, which is multiflora-herbs. I do educational consulting where we talk about a lot of these same topics and sort of apply them to more individual situations, and that's available on the same website. So yeah, I welcome people to reach out to me. I'll do my best to kind of get back to you on it, and I'm always open if people want to have a conversation.
Awesome stuff, everyone. Well, for those of you who have tuned into this, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully one day you can build your own holistic dynasty.